We're just days away now from the start of the Candidates Tournament 2022. So we've got an absolute ton of superstars in action. The one I'm most excited about is Alireza Firouzja, the 18-year-old chess prodigy from Iran, now living in France with French citizenship. We also have Hikaru Nakamura in action, streaming sensation. He's come back to play professional chess earlier this year and just stormed the events he played in. We've got Ding Liren. He qualified by being on the May ratings list as the highest rated player who wasn't already qualified. So tons of superstars. But I want to consider, what will Alireza actually play in his first game as black against pawn to e4? Now at first I thought possibly he might go e5, stay solid, but then as I was reflecting on this, looking at his past games, thinking about his most frequently played defence, you can see it's overwhelmingly the Sicilian defence. If you look in chessgames.com, he's played the Sicilian 85 times in response to e4. Now not all of his games will be on chessgames.com, but you've got a lot of them on there. So I suspect he'll go with this one to try and instantly imbalance the position, take the fight to his opponent, really do his prep. But I am curious, what do you think he'll play against 1e4? And I'll cover a couple more videos thinking about some other openings in the next couple of days, because the tournament starts round 1 this Friday, 17th of June. Opening ceremonies on Thursday, then we're into round 1. So let's look at this game here. It's the last time he played the Sicilian defence. He had black here, in a classical game I should say. He had black here. He was playing in the FIDE Grand Swiss. His opponent here was Dariusz Swisher. I know I'm butchering that pronunciation. He's a Polish-American player, now residing in America, but born in Poland. And he was actually the youngest grandmaster, Polish player to ever become a grandmaster and get that title. So a very strong player in his own right. He kicks off with e4 here, and Alireza goes c5 in response. So knight to f3, pawn d6, and after these standard opening moves here, Alireza actually plays the Najdorf defence with pawn to a6 in this position here. Now white has so many responses to this, really everything under the sun has been tried, but here white goes for pawn to f4. This is the so-called Amsterdam variation, and Alireza now strikes back in the centre here, the classic Najdorf move with pawn to e5. The knight drops back, it's pressuring this pawn, and Alireza just defends it. He holds it like this. So bishop to d3 from white, bishop e7, both players now castled, and king h1 is a tidy move here, prophylaxis, coming off the open diagonal, coming away from checks. And now Alireza doesn't bring this knight to c6, it doesn't actually sit well there, because from d7, which is what he played, now it has access to c5, where it not only pressures this bishop, but also the e4 pawn. So now we had this pawn to a4 played, a nice standard break in these structures. You actually cramp on that b5 move, which black so often wants to play. So Alireza now jumps his knight into c5, pawn a5, continues that queenside squeeze, and the bishop now developed is coming to c6 to look at this e4 pawn. So bishop e3 from white developing, and now Alireza plays a move here which looks slightly strange. You very often see this rook sitting on the c-file, for example, but he swings it all the way across to the e-file. Looks like he's just jamming in all his pieces, but he's got a very specific idea here. He wants to take on f4, and then the rook will be opened down here, but he goes with this rook and not this one, because maybe later this can support an f-pawn break, something like that. Now it begs the question for me, well, what if white actually closed the position here, tried to make these rooks look really stupid? Well, then black can actually break with pawn to d5, this is the key. You could have prepared it with bishop c6 as well, but basically black is getting a good game here. You can't actually take on d5. For example, if you took like this, then you're running into this problem of pawn to e4, and even if you take the knight, the rook still holds the pawn here. And there are other variations where white starts by taking the knight, but none of it's very good. Better game for black here. So that's why white didn't actually close the position with pawn to f5. Instead, queen d2 was played. Alireza took here, bishop recaptures, and now he hits c6 with his bishop, pressures that pawn. It was defended by the rook, and he played knight to h5 here, pressuring that bishop, so it dropped back into e3. White doesn't want to cede the bishop pair, and now Alireza again plays a nice move here. He goes bishop to f6, and at first glance it looks like this knight is now trapped because it's got no retreat square. So if white goes g4, are you not winning a whole piece? Well, the trick is actually bishop takes on c3. You have to take back because the queen is attacked, and now you can take on e4 here. And after bishop takes, rook takes back, the whole thing's actually collapsing for white. For example, if you took this knight here, well then there's rook to c4, you hit the queen and you open up here, so the queen can't take like this, for example, or you take on f3. This is one of the drawbacks in the Sicilian when you're playing it from the white side. If you get too trigger happy with your pawns, you can pay for it later in the game against your king. So okay, we didn't have pawn g4 played, white recognised that one, so running back here, bishop d4 was played instead, challenging that powerful bishop. We had an exchange here, knight recaptures, and now Alireza hopped the knight back into the game, pressures e4 once again, but white now goes knight to f5, and this is really a brilliant move because you give a pawn if black wants to take it. You're bringing a lot of pieces into the attack. A knight on f5 is often worth a pawn, Gary Kasparov used to say. And if Alireza had taken this one, which of course the computer wants, it loves to material grab, well after knight takes, let's say queen to f4, I mean this looks really scary for a human player. The knight is actually attacked, say it dropped into c5, bishop c4 for argument's sake, and for the sake of a pawn, white just has this huge initiative, lots of pieces around the king, looks very scary. So I can understand why Alireza didn't play this. Instead of taking the e-pawn, he played rook to e5 here. He activates that one a bit more, covers this d5 square, maybe prepares to double, but white carries on undeterred, queen to g5, threatening to actually mate the king in one, and so knight to e6 was played, covers the mating threat, hits the queen, and that one now dropped into h4, and it's a really difficult position for black to actually play now. So queen d8 was played by Alireza. He's got a long-term plan now of moving the king, hopping the knight back, and trying to exchange queens. But in the meantime, white brings more firepower into the attack. So rook f1, the king came to h8, now this other rook came to the centre, and here the best move is actually chopping the pawn on a5, which is now unprotected. You could do this one, but again, it just looks so scary to play like this. So Alireza dropped back with the knight. He offers that queen exchange, but white declined it, drops back. When you're the side attacking, you want to keep pieces on the board. And now g6 was played, prophylaxis against the mating threat, and the knight hopped back to e3 here. And it's just a really pleasant position for white now. Good control over d5, and this pawn on e4 is just giving white all the space versus this pawn on d6. So knight to f6 from Alireza. This knight came to c4, hits the rook. So knight h5 was now a really important move. You pick up this tempo on the queen so that after it moves away, it's no longer pressuring d6, and you can slide your rook over here, your queen now protects it, and this is Alireza's hope now that he can drum up some play against the white king because he's under pressure in the centre of the board here, he's got less space. So rook e2 now from white, preparing to double rooks. Alireza goes rook to g4, opening up his queen here to join the attack. The rook's doubled on the file, queen h4, and now there are threats around the king, so the knight jumped back here, and now it's really hard for black to actually find good improving moves. So Alireza just actually comes all the way back with his queen, comes to e7, covers this pawn from the rook attack, but now this knight can come to d4. White's really turning the screw in this position. King to g8 from Alireza, the knight chopped on c6, picks up that wonderful bishop, but here now white cracks. He kind of shows why he's a 26-50 and not a 27-50. He just plays a bit hastily here. You can actually wait on the position and it's very hard for black to do too much, but white goes pawn to e5 here. But the problem with this is a very concrete tactical one, which is queen h4 can come and you hit the knight on c4 and threaten knight g3 check. So white decided to cover this one, but now Alireza picks up here. He gets 2 minors for the rook and he's doing better in this position. So the pawn took on d6. This is white's main hope now. Can this one run down the board? Alireza goes queen d5, preparing to corral it. And you might think queen d3 is the move, but white finds a nice idea here. So queen to f2 played first, hits f7. You don't want to drop that one, so knight g5 was played, hits the rook. And now that one came to d3, getting behind the pawn. Alireza took here, but pawn to d7 comes. This looks scary, but now the knight hops back. And you've actually got 3 pieces covering the square, so black is okay for the moment. The rook came into d6, pressuring this pawn. But actually it's the wrong plan here, because when Alireza brings his knight back into the game, white should actually double now, hold on to this dangerous pawn, but instead this one was grabbed, and now Alireza can actually pick up the dangerous d-pawn. White does take here, black takes here, so you have the 2 connected passers, but this should be winning for black with enough correct steps. So rook to a7 was played, hits the black queen, supported from afar by the white queen, queen to e8, and now pawn to c4. White gets those ones rolling, and the next moves are very logical really. Black just looks to bring the pieces into the game. White tries to get the pawns going with the rooks behind them. So pawn b4 played, queen c6, the rook came behind the pawn. This one hit d4, and now this rook drops back, just preparing to come to b2. The rook sits so well behind passed pawns in these kind of positions. So rook to e8 from Alireza, hits the open file, rook b2, queen to e4 centralizing, and this is the key for Alireza now, generate play around the white king. So pawn to b5 played, and now knight to e3. Here come the cavalry coming at the king, and this is why you can't just go say pawn to c5 here, or then there's knight to g4. You hit the queen, you also just add pressure around the king. There's different checks that might be coming now. Say that queen came to f1, well then there's queen e5, threatening mate here. If pawn g3 to cover, well now knight back to e3, you've opened a new diagonal. There's just so many tactical problems here. That's the problem with these knights just hopping around. So the pawn didn't kick on to c5, instead the queen just nudged back to e1 here. Alireza now goes queen to f4, so he's looking at this rook, eyeing it menacingly, and looking at h2, preparing to set up mating threats with knight to g4. So queen to g3 was played, Alireza ducked the exchange. Now he also eyeballs this rook, which is unprotected, so this one now came to e1, pressures against this knight, but Alireza just ignores it. He goes king to g7 because you can't actually take that one, or then you leave your back rank. This is mate. So many problems for white now. Alireza's just in his element. So queen to f2 from white here. This knight now came into f5. The queen's eyeballing the rook on b2, so it dropped back to b1, and now knight g4 hits the white queen. It came into f4 here, and queen h4 from Alireza. Looks at h2, looks at the e1 rook. It's attacked twice, and you can't go g3 or you walk into mate. And if you take this one on e8, well now there's knight f2 check. Once again, these knights are just killing the king. Taking with the queen is no good, the endgame is lost. So the whole thing's collapsing for white. After this move of queen to h4, we had rook f1 played. Now this one came into e4. Again, more tactics. You can't take or you get mated here. So the queen came to c7, holding this pawn. But Alireza crashed through anyway, and this is probably the most beautiful tactic of them all, because if the queen recaptures, well then you go knight to g3 check, king g1 forced, knight e2 check, king h1, and now you take here, setting up this classic Anastasia's mate. I think it's called Anastasia's, using the knight and rook, really classic checkmate. So that's why we didn't have that one actually being captured. After queen c7, knight takes on h2, now the king came to g1, but it's all over at this stage, too much material loss. This one was recaptured by the rook. Now Alireza took on c4, and after queen e5 check, queen f6, here white resigned, the pawns are collapsing, you're a knight down, just a beautiful crush from Alireza. So he really understands the Sicilian defence, the counter punches. Will he be playing it in the upcoming candidates? If you want to see another amazing game from Alireza, click here. Thanks very much for watching, see you soon.